So I am Tim Bussey. I'm one of the pastors on staff here. And as you notice, we went all in on the baseball theme. Because let's face it, we are a football town, which makes no sense to me because we do have the thrill of victory on Saturdays with the Buckeyes. But we also have the agony of defeat with the Browns on Sunday. And I've often wondered, why do we put ourselves through this? Maybe we should do a little bit more baseball. Now, I got to tell you something. I'm not an Indians fan. I'm actually a Reds fan. But the shirt I was going to wear, here's a humble brag, I was going to wear today. When I put it on, it came down to here on me, on my elbows. And it was really big on me because I've actually lost some weight. And so, yeah, I'll take the applause. It's been arduous. It's been horrible. But I've lost some weight, so last night about 7 o'clock, my wife and I, because she saw my second outfit and she told me we had to find something else to wear on stage. But I am a Reds fan. I have been through and through. When I was really young, you had the big red machine that I followed. We've had some pretty lean years, but in 1990, when I was a freshman, that's a long time ago, in college, they won the World Series. And I will tell you that I will jump on the Guardians bandwagon because typically it's around this time of year when the Reds have been mathematically eliminated from the playoffs. But baseball was my first love growing up when I lived in Lancaster, Ohio. I can remember as a kid, 1980 was my sweet spot of collecting baseball cards. I could tell you everyone in their starting lineups for every team. While most kids went to bed listening to music, I fell asleep on the West Coast trips where the Cincinnati Reds listening to Marty Brennaman and Joe Nuxhall. That was what I did. I loved baseball. And I played baseball. That was the one sport that I actually played, and I was incredibly mediocre. And actually, there's a photo of me. There he is right there, playing for the Elks. I was a two-time All-Star, and I was on a meteoric rise until pitchers learned how to throw a curveball. Then I was out. But in my checkered past, I had hit 2 home runs in my life, and I remember the potential third really stands out in my head. See, there was a kid on the mound. He was a left-hander. For some reason, I could hit lefties well. The only problem was we never had lefties pitching. They were always righties, and I didn't hit the ball. But in this particular instance, this lefty threw the ball. I hit the ball, and I don't know if you play softball or baseball, when you hit the sweet spot, you just know. It felt so good coming off the bat. It was like a rocket sailing out to right center field, and I was like a gazelle running around first base. And I got rounded second, and as I got to about second base, it was almost as though someone had slipped on a baby grand piano to my back. And I slowed down considerably. My dad, who's a third base coach, and in fact, you can see the team photo. Here's my dad. He's the one with the hat on the far left side. That's my dad. He was the third base coach, and he was admonishing me going, "You better go faster." To which I thought, what's he talking about? They're still chasing the ball in the outfield. Well, I couldn't have been any more wrong because about an eighth of the way there, the catcher received the ball from the relay man, and I thought, uh-oh, homie's got to slide. And when I did, the catcher did his due diligence. He blocked the plate, and I was out quite decisively. And I can just remember feigning an injury to my right leg to cover the emotional gash I was feeling. And so my dad, while he had no clue I was faking it, the 2 other coaches were actually showing concern of my right leg, and he joined in on the conversation and bent down and says, "Is that all the faster you could run?" So as I stated, I could actually hit off lefties well, but again, there were a lot more right-handers. But left-hander batters and left-handed pitchers are very much coveted by baseball minds. And so why do these baseball front offices drool over left-handers? Very quickly, if you're a left-handed batter, first of all, they have the prettiest swing in the world. And because there's a lot of people who are throwing right-handed, they can see the ball very easily. But then a left-handed batter in thought and process, they actually can just pivot and run to first, while a right-hander has to take a couple steps out of the batter's box before they can get to first. So they actually have a little bit of an advantage by getting there a little quicker to first. Now, what really is coveted in baseball is the left-handed pitcher. And what we find out about them is that because righties don't see lefties very often, the spin of the ball comes out of their hands just very different, and it just confuses them. And plus, when a pitcher's kind of in that stretch position, he's looking at home plate, he's also looking at first base, you can't steal off of a lefty very well. And I can tell you that there were many sports-minded fathers who have tried to force their kids to be lefties with the visions of their sons playing in the highest level, making bukus of money. Now, I know some of you guys are thinking, is he going to talk sports the entire sermon? And I'm going to leave all you sports folks out there. Non-sports fans, we're going to pivot now onto something else. But I do want to know this. With a lefty, how many lefties are in the room today? Loud and proud, raise that left hand nice and proud. Let me see what we got. It's hard to look, but I can see hands that are out there. And do you know that like worldwide, it is like 10 to 12% of our world are left-handers. So in a room, let's say there's 600, my KCC math is telling me there should be around 60-ish or so of you who are lefties. So can we just give lefties unite here? Yeah. I'm not a lefty, I don't care. But here, I Googled up some more lefties, and I looked this up on the internet, and we know that everything on the internet's true, so we'll see. Here's the first person, famous lefty. We got Sir Paul McCartney, right, of Beatles fame. If you're, I guess he was some big deal in the rock and roll business, I don't know. Then you had Tom Cruise. Yeah, he's a famous lefty. He forever looks 35. Then you have Keanu Reeves. I got nothing on Keanu Reeves. But there's some female infusion here. Let's do Julia Roberts is another lefty. Hello, Miss Brockovich. And then Oprah. Oprah is another famous lefty. Now, my girls would be very angry with me this morning, so I'm going to point out that I also found out that Justin Bieber is also left-handed. I don't get him, I don't understand. But anyway, they do. And I also found this very interesting. Of all the few left-handers that are in this world, that we had a string of presidents that were lefties. In fact, numbers 40, 41, 42, and 44 were all left-handers. If you don't know who they are, that was Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, and Obama. That feels pretty rare. And then if you go into Supreme Court, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a left-hander. Beyond that, you had also some more influential people like Leonardo da Vinci, Bill Gates, Albert Einstein. But my most influential lefty of my time is this guy right here, Ned Flanders of Simpsons fame. I mean, the guy had his own store, the Leftatorium, for crying out loud. So, but another famous lefty who often gets left off this list is a guy by the name of Ehud. And as I've previewed this with some people, when I say Ehud, they go, huh? And one person even yesterday made me show her in the Bible exactly where Ehud was, because she didn't believe she believed that I just made him up. So I want you to go to the 7th book of the Old Testament. So you're going to go to Judges. So that's Matthew, that's the New Testament. We're going to go to the Old Testament of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges. All right, so we're at Judges, chapter 3, verse 12, and just hold yourself right there for a moment. I really love the book of Judges. And so the little history lesson that starts with this is previously, in the book of Joshua, he had finally led the tribes of Israel into the promised land. Now, think Moses. Remember Moses freeing the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage, and they were wandering in the forest for 40 years, mainly because when there were 12 tribes that went to go check on the land, 10 said you couldn't do it because of these giants, 2 said you could, and those 2 were Caleb and Joshua. Well, the crowd listened to the 10, and God finally said, you're it. You're going to be wandering for 40 years because of your non-belief. And so all those folks died, the new generation came in, Joshua led them into the promised land, and as we get to this beginning of Judges, we find Joshua is going to die, and he has died. But he has been asking for people to obey the Torah. But the problem was the Israelites had a major issue with doing that. Now, the book of Judges comes from this idea of the leaders of that time. Before there were kings, now there will be kings eventually, they were ruled by judges. And so don't think courtroom here. It's not like, Chief Justice Roberts of our current Supreme Court is going to go out and, start calling up arms in Iran or anything of that nature. But they were some people who did some sort of judging, but they were regional, they were political, they were military leaders, they were tribal chieftains. And so you got to be warned, if you do read the book of Judges, it can be disturbingly violent. And again, it's a tale of Israel not able to listen and having this moral corruption and bad leadership. And they became no different than the people around them. There's also a cycle that we see here in the book of Judges. And you know I'm not a great preacher because I can't come up with them with the first same letter, but here's the cycle. And the cycle goes like this. First, there's peace in the land. That means the Israelites are running on all cylinders. Everything is going great. They're following God. But then soon, sin would enter in, and they would get tired of serving God. They began to find this moral corruption come into their society, and they started to serve lowercase g gods. And so you knew things were really bad in the book of Judges because you would see this phrase, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and you're going to see that a little later on. Remember that phrase. Then you see number 3 is the distress. And because of their actions, God would get the attention of the Israelites and allow an enemy to conquer their land and to enslave them. And so after a long period of time, there would be the cry out. And the Israelites were classic. They were the classic, you don't know what you got till it's gone. And so they would be tired of the servant lifestyle, and they would call out for a leader to rise up to deliver them. And then finally, you have the rescue. Finally, God would see the hearts of the Israelites. They were repentant, and so then God would direct them to a hand-chosen judge. And this would revert back to number 1 and recycle through this process. In the book of Judges, this is going to happen 11 times, and then you're going to read another time in 1 Samuel. And now, here are our judges here. There are 12 of them, and they'll be up there on the stage here in a second. Well, not on the screen, not on the stage. That'd be something, wouldn't it? But here are the judges, and the ones that are highlighted just means that they had a little bit more of a story to them. So from Othniel all the way down to Samson, we're talking about a period between 325 to 350 years of this cycle that the Israelites would live in. Now, to give some perspective, remember, we're coming up on the big 250, right, as a nation. And so, for us, it's been, 47 leaders, 47 presidents, and 250 years. We're talking about an additional 100 years on top of that. So we're talking about a very large swath of time from Judges 1 through Judges 12, then into 1 Samuel. So let's get back to Ehud, our famous lefty. Now, many of you may not know the story, but if you were in youth ministry and your youth minister was worth his salt, he told this story because there's a lot of immature humor that comes up really soon in this book. And I know I enjoyed teaching it when I was in youth ministry. So Judges chapter 3, verse 12 through 14. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and because of this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel. Getting the Ammonites and the Amalekites to join him, Eglon came and attacked Israel. And they took possession of the city of palms, which is Jericho. And the Israelites were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. So here we have it. The very first judge in verse 11, Othniel, had given and delivered peace in the land for 40 years. But now they strayed, and there's the unfortunate verse in verse 12. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, notice in 3 verses, we have covered 18 years. And we hit number 3 and number 4 on our cycle. We've hit the sin, and we've hit the distress. Also, before we can get to our hero, we begin to talk about our antagonist, Eglon. He's from Moab, which is next door to Israel. In fact, if you look at a map, if you look at the Dead Sea, to the east in the brown, you're going to see where Moab is. And in the green area, that is to the west, and that is where Israel is. And so you see geographically, they're very close in nature. And so you knew that they certainly were no strangers to conflict. So we'll catch up with our bad guy here in a second. Verse 15. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord and gave them a deliverer, Ehud, a left-handed man, the son of Jerah the Benjamite. The Israelites sent him with a tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. So the drift away from God, and they have this 18 years of slavery. They finally caught up with them after 18 years, and they cry out for someone to free them under this horrible regime. And so that man was the protagonist today, Ehud, which is number 4, the cry out, and number 5, the rescue on this cycle that Israel would go through. Now, the big takeaway is the emphasis of Ehud being what? left-handed. And there's a lot of significance as to why this is pointed out to us as the reader. Now, there's some who lean into the word left-handed. Now, the Hebrew phrase for this is weak or restricted in the right hand, which would seem to communicate that Ehud couldn't do well rather than what God could possibly do for him. In fact, it was that he could have had a physical difference that most people even saw as even potentially a disability. But also in that time period, left-handers were often seen as weaker, as less honorable. And as you go throughout history, there has been this view of left-handers that for many cultures, saying that left-handed was pretty much a bad thing. Left-handers, people have been considered unlucky and even evil. And in fact, the word sinister comes from the Latin word for left. In Britain in the Middle Ages, lefties were associated with the devil and often accused of witchcraft and then burned at the stake. Thankfully, you left-handers, you don't have to worry about this today, do you? Today all you gripe about is Spirobone notebooks, smudging the ink that you wore it across, playing guitar, certain types of scissors. I've heard that one a lot. You guys are really oppressed, aren't you? But interesting enough, some studies suggest that there are more people who are left-handed, but because of this thing seen as such a bad deal, that people didn't want to admit to the fact that they were left-handed. So what we find out about our guy Ehud is he had a physical limitation that caused him to be left-handed dominant, but maybe at best, he was just a pariah in the perception of the people around him because he was a natural lefty. Now, this last part here talks about Ehud paying a tribute. And this scripture just depicts how bad things had gotten, because not only were you paying taxes to these people, but then you also had to submit to them and tell them how great they were and give them all the praise and all these platitudes. And so that had to be a lot of fun, too. So now we go on to verses 16 through 17. It says, now Ehud made a double-edged sword about a cubit long, which is around 18 inches. Which he would strap to his right thigh under his clothing. He presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. All right, words mean something. And the fact that Ehud has his sword strapped to his right thigh is very important in the next couple of minutes. But how about the Bible calling someone very fat? I don't know how many extra pounds he was carrying. I don't know if he was just overweight or if he was like Guinness Book of World Record overweight. There's a difference here. We'll get back to that. Verse 18. After Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way those who had carried it. But on reaching the stone image near Gilgal, he himself went back to Eglon and said, Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you. The king said to attendants, Leave us. And they left. So after this little song and dance of the tribute in the presentation, they left. Well, Ehud went with the entourage, got to a certain spot, it says Gilgal, and then said he promptly returned back to see the king. Now here there's a bit of ambiguity as it relates to Ehud telling King Eglon that he had a special message. Because some will say maybe he was telling a lie. I don't know. All I know is this. It was a special message. It was dripping with a lot of manipulation because he was trying to get the king, for he and the king to be alone. And so this was an obvious trap as to what's going to happen next. It says, then the king sends all the attendants out, and it's just Ehud and Eglon together, separated from everyone else. And in verse 20, Ehud says, I have a message from God. And as the king arose from his feet, Ehud drew his sword and plunged it into the king's very ample belly. Now, the question you may have, as well as I do, is how did Ehud sneak a sword in the presence of such an important individual? I mean, where was the king's secret service? Again, most people were right-handed. And if you were left-handed, you probably hid that fact because you didn't want to be labeled in such derogatory terms. And so the king's guards very well could have done their job. They just did it very poorly. Because if they were checking, they were probably checking on the left side because most people were right-handed and they're going to draw the sword from that side. Well, Ehud again is what? Very good. He is left-handed, which means the weapon is going to be on this side, hidden in plain sight. Now, there's two very immature sections of scripture here that very much humor me. Verse 22 gets a little graphic. When you read about the enormity of the king, by the fact that when Ehud, when his sword went into his belly rolls, it said that it swallowed his sword. And I can only imagine he was going, that's my favorite sword. I don't know. But the other part, verses 24 and 25, where his attendants are waiting on Ehud. Remember, they're all outside. It was just Ehud and Eglon, and it says that his attendants, again, the Bible, not me, the attendants all assumed that King Eglon was relieving himself, and they waited until the point of embarrassment. Now, if you're waiting for someone to relieve themselves, they're not doing a number onesie. I'll let you think about what the rest of that would be. But due to the long period of Ehud was able to escape, he was jumped out of the window, and at that point he would blow a horn, and the Israelites came from the mountains and struck down 10,000 Moabites that day. No one escaped. And from that one courageous individual, Israel would have peace in the land for a whopping 80 years. And this all happened because one guy listened to God who said you could, and not to a society that said you couldn't possibly. He didn't allow a perceived weakness to define who he was, especially when Ehud was with God. He knew that with God, all things are possible. So, 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10 says this, and this is what Paul wrote in the New Testament. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness and insults and hardships and persecution and difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong. See, Paul himself dealt with a mysterious personal struggle, his thorn in the flesh. Yet he knew the magic sauce, that God's power is far more evident when we are not strong on our own, but we depend on him. That is literally throughout the Bible, through a lot of your stories, well-known stories, you see where the miraculous happens because of perceived deficiency. Let me give you some examples. In the realm of insecurity and self-doubt, I got two of them. Moses being slow of speech, and yet he would eventually lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Yet Gideon, who was another judge that was a little further on the list, he was the weakest of his clan, the weakest in his family, and yet he would lead a nation with a small ragtag bunch of Israelis to defeat the enemy. How about in fear and hesitation? Peter would deny Jesus 3 times out of personal safety, but then go on to establish the church. Or in moral failure and personal flaws, look no further than David with his sins and the extramarital affairs with Bathsheba and then killing off her husband. Or Samson, yet another judge down the list, who was all sorts of a mess with repeatedly bad choices, and yet he would kill the invading Philistines to the tune of 3,000 in one day. Then you had others who struggled with physical limitations and ongoing struggles, like Sarah being barren and being too old to have a child. Yet at the ripe old age of 90, she did. Or how about Mary, who was too young to be married, but willing to carry the Savior of the world to a bunch of people who were going to jump to obvious conclusions. And finally, how about the unusual traits of the social disadvantage, like our heroine from the past 4 messages of this last series, Esther, being a minority in a foreign empire to leading for such a time as this. Or our hero today, Ehud, being looked down upon for simply being left-handed. Just as we are made weak, we will shine like the stars when we acknowledge and when we let go and we say, God, I need you so much in my life. So what are 3 truths we can learn from this today? Number 1, God uses what looks like a limitation as a strategic advantage. If we just recap here, again, Ehud being left-handed, he was out of his culture, people would look at him as even disadvantaged, and yet those traits allowed him to conceal a weapon, approach the king without suspicion, and what seemed like a weakness was the exact means of deliverance. Now, what can we learn from that ourselves? What's the truth we can learn? What you assume disqualifies you may actually be the way God chooses to work most powerfully in your life. And I've got a modern day example of this. My friend Tim Bailey. He was born with cerebral palsy, and he overcame an awful lot of challenges, like coordination issues with his hands, being institutionalized. He had been tranquilized, but the challenges were even amplified more because of the fact he was a DD individual in a day that treated him less than. And yet through his time in the institution, he got better coordination. And according to his mother, he said it enabled him to become a human being. He had a desire to play the piano, and boy, what a great decision that was. He had the innate ability to hear a song and then play it. And eventually his parents took him on the road. They traveled all across the United States as a concert artist to hear his incredible talents, but more importantly, to hear his incredible testimony. He played in 13 countries. He won a gold medal at the International Paralympics in Yokohama, Japan. He met his idol, Liberace, even played a song together. He met more dignitaries and presidents than all of us in this room. And funny enough, he was a guy who just roamed around these hallways for years and years. And sadly, my friend Tim died on April the 4th after a courageous bout with cancer. I just want you to take a look at his incredible talents, just for like 1 minute.
Usually when I have a concert, people always will call out and say, "Could you play How Great Thou Art?" I said, "Great Thou How Art, okay."
Wow. He was supposed to play that song live today, but he was a true maestro on the piano 1 minute, and the next minute he's calling me Bim Tussy and speaking to me in a SpongeBob voice. But man, did that guy ever maximize his talents through what the world would consider a weakness today. We assume what disqualifies you may actually be the thing that God chooses to work most powerfully in you, because God truly takes what appears to be a limitation and he turns it into a strategic advantage for him. The second thing we can learn today is that God's power is not dependent on conventional strength or status. You know, Ehud wasn't a warrior king or a prominent leader. He was an unlikely deliverer sent during a time when the Israelites were oppressed by the Moabites. And the victory didn't come through an army at first, but it came through one unexpected, courageous bit of obedience. So what truth can we learn from this? Is that God doesn't need ideal conditions or impressive people. He works through availability and obedience. What's the modern day example of this? A guy by the name of Jim Abbott. He was born on September 19th, 1967. And at birth, he was born with a fully developed, he was born without, I should say, a fully developed right hand, often described as congenital limb deficiency. There's just no reason why it was this way. It was just natural development. And so as Jim grew up, he discovered his love for baseball, and his parents encouraged him to participate in sports rather than limiting himself because of his right hand. And so they pushed him to compete just like everyone else. But you know, with one hand, he's going to have some struggles and adjustments that needed to happen that other little leaguers didn't have to deal with. But his father, Mike, played a huge role in teaching him how to throw efficiently and field with just one arm. Now, it took tons and tons of talent, but he did it. And as a child, he learned to pitch with his left hand and quickly put the glove back onto his right hand. And so the coordination to perform such a feat is just mind-blowing. But the cool part was he just didn't participate. He excelled as a star on his team. He earned a scholarship to the University of Michigan, which is truly the most tragic part of this entire story. But in 1987, he won the James E. Sullivan Award as the top amateur athlete in the United States. In 1988, he won a gold medal for the baseball team. Also that year, he was drafted 8th overall by the California Angels. He made his MLB Major League debut in 1989. In the climax of his career, some of you Guardian fans may remember, in 1993, he pitched a no-hitter against them. And while I could not find the exact number of starting pitchers in the Hall of Fame who've done this, by my count, there were 7 who were in the Hall of Fame who had not done that feat. Look, I don't know if Jim Abbott was a believer or not, but what he has stated in the past was it took perseverance, a change of mindset, and a desire to overcoming what others say was his weakness. But this certainly defines how God doesn't need ideal conditions or impressive people to complete his work. That God's power is not dependent on conventional strength or status. Now the third one is this, is weakness invites reliance, which opens the door for God's intervention. Israel's situation was one of repeated failure and oppression. Their cry set the stage for God to act, and Ehud, his mission itself required a lot of trust. So, what's the truth that we can learn? Acknowledging our weaknesses. It's often what precedes God's strongest movement. Now, this last part, I brought in the object lesson, and that's me. I'm the modern day example. I was barely above average student in high school and in college, and most of that was pretty much because I was lazy. But from there, I went on to the workforce, and I was all sorts of horrible my first job in that I couldn't organize myself out of a wet paper bag. And in fact, it was so bad that my bosses made me go to a Franklin Templeton time management deal up in Cincinnati. It was horrible, it was brutal. And on top of that, I really felt the heat. And so I thought maybe I was going to get fired. But I was throwing this life preserver because there was another church who expressed interest in me, and they said, we'll pay $10,000 more than what you're getting now. Don't ever go to a church or anywhere because of money. But I will say, to me, that opened my eyeballs, and it got me out of Dodge. And so I left, and I got the offer, and I moved to Indiana. I learned that running from one problem doesn't necessarily mean there aren't other issues that are going to rear its ugly head. And there were other issues that did arise. And while I thought I had cleared up some of these other things I learned from my past, unbeknownst to me, things were going on behind my back that I didn't know about. On a Monday in early November 2001, I was asked to be part of an impromptu meeting with the senior minister, the executive minister, 2 elders. And in my naive head, I was like, great, they're gonna add another person on staff because they see this ministry growing. Nope, they said, we don't need you anymore. Your services are no longer needed. So if you're counting, I'm the second guy on this stage in the last couple weeks to talk about being fired from a job. We truly are the land of misfit toys around here. So here's the deal. I was not even 30 years old. I ran from one ministry, got fired from another, and I felt like I had no talent to offer God. I wanted to serve him, but after 2 failed ministry tries, if the next one didn't work out, my plan B was of all failed ministers was selling insurance or used cars. And so the third job took me out of my comfort zone. Instead of being in the Midwest, I was in the Mid-Atlantic. And I thought where I was in North Carolina felt like 1,000,000 miles away. And so with much trepidation and with zero confidence, I gave it one more time. But this time I said, God, you're going to fill in the gaps of my ineptitude. And when you hear the results, in 1 year, a middle school ministry grew from 20 kids to 120 kids. I had the opportunity to be a lead minister in organizing an event that brought 5,000 people to one event for one outdoor service. After 1.5 years, I was doing other ministry. They sucked me back into youth ministry to a high school section that they were depleted, they were on life support, and we were able to grow that thing up to 80 and 90 students. And from there, that ministry formed a Hispanic ministry with kids and their adults. Now, I can't speak, I can say hola, that's it. But the fact is, within a couple of years, we were feeding that community both physically and spiritually. We provided ESL classes. We supported hundreds and hundreds of kids with school supplies and Christmas presents each and every year. And it was also in North Carolina where I found my first experience working with our DD individuals and was tasked to do our first Tim Tebow Night to Shine for individuals with special needs. And to think that the reason I'm on this stage in Canton, Ohio, working with our DD community was because I was the only one on staff in North Carolina who could actually organize the event for the Tebow prom. See, God had pushed me a long way from the days of being forced to go to a Franklin Templeton time management seminar because I couldn't organize myself. And my time in North Carolina ended up being a near 18-year fruitful ministry. But it wasn't me. Please hear me when I say it. It wasn't me. God provided in the areas of my shortcomings and gets all the glory for all my weaknesses and deficiencies. It goes back to this truth that we can learn. Acknowledge our weaknesses. And when we do that, it often precedes God's strongest movement. And when our weakness invites reliance, we see God's intervention show up. Let's look at these two verses again in 2 Corinthians 12. Verse 9, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And verse 10, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Now, I obviously haven't any idea as to what you perceive as a weakness in your life. But I do know this, we all have them. It may be a physical limitation, it may be a developmental one, it could be a lot of things, but odds are it's Satan, who's great at convincing and whispering in your ears, telling you that you can't. You know, Satan does a really good job at what he does. And it would be really great to spot him. If I said, Satan, come on out, and he's wearing the red spandex suit and the horns and the thing, you're like, hey, yeah, that's Satan. But he's far more cunning and conniving and convincing when he lurks in the shadows of your minds to manipulate and to focus on the things that you can't. Now, very quickly, I'm gonna list some things. If this sounds like you, write them down. I don't know if you're taking notes, and if you're not taking notes, make a mental snapshot and revisit this a little bit later on. What are some things you struggle with? Is it worry, fear, doubt, insecurity, discouragement, anger, impatience, pride, an unforgiving heart, lack of discipline, addictive behaviors, loneliness, low self-worth, shame, feeling overwhelmed? Maybe you have a distance from God. Maybe you're struggling to trust God. Giving into temptations. That's just a small list. You've maybe heard yours, maybe you haven't. But I want you to be encouraged. And you're like, really? You just exposed this like ugly gaping wound. But yes, I do want you to be discouraged. I do want you to be encouraged. You know why? I want you to be encouraged because we are all human. And we all fall short of the glory of God. But know this truth, that God's power is not limited by your limitations. See, the less we rely on ourselves, the more we experience God. And if you can accept, and that's a really important word here the next couple of moments, if you can accept this truth and apply it into your life, just wait and see what God can do for you. I'm telling you right now, Ehud accepted that challenge and God did it for him. Tim Bailey accepted that challenge and God did it for him. Jim Abbott accepted that challenge and God did it for him. And I'm telling you right now, I am living proof, I am living testimony that once I accepted that God could do immeasurably more than I could ever hope or imagine, I'm telling you, he did it for me, and I can guarantee you, you are not exempt. You are not the exception. So if you want to hit a home run in life, accept that challenge too, that God will indeed do the very same for you. Let's pray. God, you are good, and I'm thankful that you fill in the gaps where we fall short. Help us to remember that you are all that we need, and that you are the one who makes impossible things become possible. We seek you, and I pray for everyone in this room to hopefully hear something that gives them this possibility of hope. To know that we cannot do it on our own without your backing and support, and to allow us to cast away our own human efforts in the whispers of the evil one. Remind us always of those two scriptures, for your power is made perfect in our weakness. And when I am weak, then you are strong. We thank you for that promise, and we love you. Amen.